So this evening, we have an amazing panel of experts here to talk to you about flood recovery and resilience in their communities. And we're so pleased to be here to be learning together and thinking about what the Mad River Valley could be doing to help us build a more flood resilient future. And to introduce our organizations, we're going to have Josh from the Mad River Valley Planning District and Ira Shaddis come up, give you an introduction, and they will be moderating the panel.
Thank you, Marcy. Lovely to see you all out here tonight. So, as Marcy said, my name is Ira Shaddis. I'm the director of Friends of the Mad River. We're a local watershed group. We're a community-supported nonprofit. And, you know, we do a lot of work broadly focused on environmental conservation, restoration, caring for the river and the surrounding watershed. And so, you know, we've been doing this work for 35 years, and in that whole time, you know, there's certainly stuff that we directly lead on ourselves. There's tree plantings and culvert replacements and things like that. But honestly, the core of our work is what we are able to do collectively together as a community, how we're able to sort of work with our partners, whether they're municipal partners, local organizations, individual volunteers, landowners, to really be good stewards of this place. And so community is really at the core of a lot of the work that we do. It really makes us effective. And that question of community resilience is really at the core of what drove us to bring this panel together. You know, when these big storms come through, as we deal with really difficult sort of dire circumstances, it can be hard to focus on the bigger picture and really hard to focus on how we can maintain our role as sort of responsible land stewards and good environmentalists. And so there's a somewhat selfish reason for us to be driving this conversation around community resilience and getting involved in that in the hopes that, you know, as we are able to respond in the short term, in the medium term, and the long term to these sort of dramatic events that happen, we're able to do so in a way that really balances our sort of diverse needs for things like, you know, housing and transportation and recreation with our sort of role as environmental and ecological stewards. So I'll just leave it there for that's my little preamble introduction about why we're doing this work, and I'll let Josh introduce himself and why the planning district is involved.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you, everybody. Yes, my name is Joshua Schwartz. I'm the director of the Mad River Valley Planning District. The Mad River Valley Planning District's in its 40th year this year in serving our community. It's a union municipal district made up with both representation and support from the towns of Waitsfield, Warren, and Fayston, Sugarbush Resort, the Mad River Valley Chamber of Commerce, and the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. So essentially that's the bosses for my coworker Sam Robinson and I. And in addition to serving as a place for these groups to meet and discuss issues and opportunities across the Mad River Valley, the staff at the planning district is involved in a variety of different activities, from big picture planning efforts to data collection and analysis, convening, technical support, and implementation across a variety of different topic areas: housing, transportation, economic development, wastewater infrastructure, recreation, and flood resilience are just some of the different topics. And one contextual thing that I did want to share, the planning district in the Mad River Valley participated in the process post-Tropical Storm Irene with support from the EPA and FEMA to do an analysis of our vulnerability and identify ways to minimize vulnerability for similar storms. And what came out of that was a geographic framework, or a framework that used geography that identified a variety of sort of longer term opportunities. And those are things like looking at river corridors to conserve and to avoid development, vulnerable settlements, protect people, buildings, and facilities in safer areas for development, plan for development there, seed development in those locations, and upland and everywhere, manage stormwater, slow it, spread it, and sink it. And this framework has been utilized across the valley, and there's been a fair amount of implementation from those steps through the towns and the different community partners. And that long view of community resilience is a really important piece of the puzzle, but so is the response and the recovery. And so I'm really excited by those that are here today to share from our neighbors in Central Vermont, sharing some of the work that they're doing as we think about both the long and the short term and the ways that we can together in a community be involved to make this place the place that we want it to be. So thank you.
I'm going to introduce these folks in just a second. But I'll just, sort of reiterate what Josh said and sort of thank you all. And just recognition, that these storms, the changing climate, the work that we have to do, it really begs us to think beyond traditional boundaries. There's a lot of good that comes out of thinking at the scale of our watershed, and we always encourage it. But our watershed, the Mad River, is part of a bigger watershed, the Winooski. And so, our neighbors just upstream and downstream, I think have some really great insights to share with us. The last 2 years, we've had these July storms. Needless to say, they're quite dramatic, and they have been quite distinct across these different communities. How the rain falls, the topography of the landscape, it really changes the way that they're felt in these communities. And it changes the character of how folks respond and recover. And so there's not just one homogeneous story, even within a 20-mile radius of where we are. There's a lot of diverse perspective and value for us to gain from hearing from the experience of these folks. So I will start at the far end. Dan Fingus, thank you, is currently serving on the 5-member Plainfield Select Board and as president of the local arts nonprofit Plainfield Arts. He leads with a passion for building a sustainable. Glasses are important. As I was saying, he leads a passion for building a sustainable, equitable future for all Vermonters, and he has demonstrated his dedication to community engagement. When the 2024 floods hit, Dan Fingus stepped up and coordinated volunteer activities for the town of Plainfield and continues to lead in the ongoing response and recovery. In his professional life, Dan is the executive director of Vermont Conservation Voters, a role he began in January 2025 after over 20 years as an organizer and leader in various social justice organizations in Michigan, Long Island, and Vermont. Thank you for joining us, Dan. And then in the middle here, we have Alyssa Johnson, who works as the Community Visit Program Director at the Vermont Council on Rural Development, where she leads community facilitation and prioritization processes across the state. Prior to joining VCRD in 2021, Alyssa was the Economic Development Director for Revitalizing Waterbury. Alyssa is serving her second term as a member of the Waterbury Select Board, currently as chair. She is a member of the Waterbury Area Housing Task Force and former chair of the Waterbury Planning Commission. Thank you for joining us. And then on the end here is John Copans, who's the executive director of the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience. Previously, he worked at Old Spokes Home, the Vermont Council for Rural Development, the Vermont Public Service Department, the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, and for Congressman Peter Welch. Nice resume. John grew up in Brattleboro, graduated from Macalester College, and lives in Montpelier with his wife and 3 kids. Thank you, John, for joining us. So we're just going to dive into questions for the panelists. We have a couple of questions written down, and then I think we'll sort of move fairly organically into questions from the audience, and then we have some additional questions as well. Does that sound good for you guys? And I'd be curious, with the questions that I'm asking here and that Josh will ask to hear from, all of you more or less for the same question. So in the last 2 years, the July storms have had devastating impacts across central Vermont. But differences in topography, the built environment, and the path these storms took led to very different outcomes in different locations. Can you describe what the 2023 and 2024 flooding looked like in your community? And really, I'm curious about sort of immediate challenges, what were longstanding issues, And is there anything that is still unresolved that we're trying to address in the community?
I wonder how much I need to describe of what Montpelier was like after July 2023. I feel like it's there was images everywhere, right? And certainly for us as a community. I actually was out of town the day of the flood and rolled back into town about 5 days later. And I think what I remember from that moment is a downtown that was just devastated, right? The amount of silt that's just sort of coated the entirety of downtown, and then the massive piles of debris sort of lining the sidewalk and between the sidewalk and the road, just throughout. And as folks know, you can't really tease out the community of Montpelier from the downtown of Montpelier. We are so blessed to have a densely settled community with one of those downtowns that you can you walk into or drive into, and you just see the community everywhere you go in that downtown. And essentially, July 10th and 11th of 2023 just put that existence and our city into a state of suspended animation, where all of that sort of commerce and community came to a halt to a large degree. And then the mode shifted into sort of a different kind of community, which extended well beyond Montpelier, which was people coming together, flocking to our city to really try to help, and to help in so many meaningful ways in terms of how we have recovered as a city. The truth is, we're still recovering as a community, and that takes a bunch of different forms. We still have homeowners who are waiting for their FEMA buyout or elevation process to come to completion 2 years after, and we're no exception, right? That is true, I think, across Vermont, right? We have a FEMA process that is both essential and totally agonizing and inane and brutal, really. And so our city hall flooded, our fire station flooded, and so there's still a depth of conversation going on with FEMA about those facilities, how much money will be transferred and what shape that will take. And the same thing is true of the Capitol complex. The Capitol complex suffered, probably $200 million of damage. It's incredible to have a tour through the basements and tunnels of our Capitol complex, and you just can't comprehend the amount of damage to all of those building systems, right? Think about all those historic buildings along State Street. And so the truth is, to some degree, that Capitol complex, all of those many of those buildings are open, but they're temporarily fixed. The permanent fixes have not been done. So there is still a tremendous amount of work in Montpelier to actually define what our future looks like, as opposed to sort of this sort of emergency state of affairs that it's still, even though things feel pretty normal when you're in town, right? The reality is beneath the surface, we're still in a state of transition from that disaster to real and meaningful recovery. Maybe I'll pause there. And there's more to get into, but I'll pass the number.
I was going to say that, Ira, as a facilitator, how many minutes are you going for in the 2023-2024 breakdown?
I was just saying it's pretty open-ended. I think hearing from you guys, hearing from your experience is the most important thing. So have at it.
I've been told this one is wiggly, so let me try my best.
So hi everyone, thanks for being here. As was said, my name is Alyssa. I'm on the Waterway Select Board. I'm going to back up even a little from 2023 to start this answer, which is just to acknowledge the impact of Tropical Storm Irene that Josh already spoke to earlier, particularly in Waterbury. I did not live in Waterbury at that time, but I think it was obviously a really important being maybe not the best word, but a formative event for the community. And when I start reflecting on 2023, the connection to Tropical Storm Irene is one of those first real touch points. While there was less individual damage for many folks than from Tropical Storm Irene, I think there's this common understanding of what a 100-year flood is. And we know that's not what the science means. It's a 1% chance per year. But kind of colloquially, day to day, I think a lot of folks think about it's a 100-year flood. It will happen once every 100 years. And as you maybe saw on the slides when you came in, a huge portion of Waterbury's downtown is in that 100-year floodplain. And so the last major flood had been 1927 when Tropical Storm Irene came in 2013. And so I think folks, again, from what I've told, my position in Waterbury as Economic Development Director was actually created in Still the Recovery in 2017 from Tropical Storm Irene. So Waterbury has had a long history of floods. And I think a defining change in 2023 is folks, including some homeowners who had been through and rebuilt from Irene, saying, it's only been 12 years and my first floor is flooded again. And so just the emotional impact of that, I think, is a big part of the conversation in our community, and recognizing that these are not maybe once in a lifetime events. These are happening with increased regularity. Again, speaking to the impact of them, 2024, literally 2 a day, a year later, significant flooding as well. So the floods were also different. So I was really glad this was a question that was asked, because in 2023, just to me, we had impacts to residential properties and commercial properties, mostly along Main Street, also down on Route 2, kind of throughout Waterbury. Again, probably a dozen folks with first floor damage, number of folks with basements filled, utilities lost. But in that way, it was a lot of inundation flooding from the Winooski River kind of concentrated in that downtown area, like John spoke about, as well as in Montpelier. In 2024, we also had real impacts where we actually had much more flash flooding or events up in the hills. So there's a subset of folks who know they live in that 100-year floodplain, who are really conscious of that and aware of that and planning. And in 2024, the impacts to community, individual homeowners, and also municipal infrastructure like roads and bridges was spread much more out throughout the community. So we had culverts and bridges up in the hills moving towards the Worcester Range out of downtown that were impacted when small, maybe just brooks, suddenly jumped their banks, or we had flash flooding events. So there was both a devastation of this kind of continued community impact and also a different geographic layout of exactly where there was. We have folks who were in the downtown and were in the floodplain who were impacted again. But that's another piece of it. I would also throw in, we had flooding in December of 2023. So I think that continual repetitive impact to me is part of the storyline of all of these events. And again, what John said about kind of that future definition, I think it's really changed the norm. The community's been aware of this, took proactive steps after Irene. We did weeks of immediate volunteer work, and thank you. I know many folks from the Valley came to Waterbury or came to Montpelier to help muck out basements. We were operating out of a municipal complex that had been relocated after Tropical Storm Irene, so it was not in 100-year floodplain. And that's where everyone showed up and lent dehumidifiers and went out to help muck out houses. So there has been some evolution in the community, but I think the big takeaway from me around these impacts is that we know it's not done. If anything, it's getting more frequent, and we're seeing the real impact that has on where folks are choosing to live, and really what the responsibility is for us as community leaders to think about how to do that responsibly.
Hey everybody, Dan Fingus, Plainfield. So very similar story here. We were unfortunately hit with floods in both 2023 and 2024. 2023, we were fortunate that it was a Winooski River-based flooding, and the way that Plainfield is built up around the river over the last 100 years is that it's very fortified, and they're there was always a worry that some houses were going to fall into the river, and so they've been working on that. And so 5 to 7 houses were affected in that flooding, and we are still 2 years later waiting for those houses to finish their buyout process through FEMA. It was obviously a huge tragedy for a number of folks in town, but pretty small scale, especially when you look to our neighbors in Montpelier and others. In 2024, it was the brook, our great brook that comes down the hills and meets the Winooski was where the flash flooding and the flooding happened. And it demolished houses all the way down the brook, including, I mean, we were so lucky that every human being was alive after that night, because there are stories of volunteer firefighters pulling a woman out of her house like through the window 10 seconds before her house went into the brook and washed away. And obviously folks probably have heard the story about the Heartbreak Hotel, which is an old boarding house turned apartment building that all of the neighbors in the apartment knocked on each other's doors, decided to go stand in a parking lot, and because they were worried, there was a lot of noise. It sounded, the brook sounded so much different than it ever had. So they were all out of the building when 90% of the building just fell over into the brook and washed down the brook. So many pets were lost in that incident, that no human beings lost their lives. And we were really lucky. We're a very small town, 1,200 people. Between the two floods, we're looking at about 38 houses or units gone. Some of them are slightly livable now, but we're waiting on the buyout processes. I would say that, our state is really good at response. We fast rescue squads, setting up shelters. There's so many things that we were so good at, the state government was ready for, and our local were able to plug into. We are really, really, really bad at recovery. And finding housing for folks who were affected, the buyout processes, the fact that FEMA is set up to deal with county governments, and we don't have county governments, nor have we figured out a way to interact with FEMA in a way that mirrors the county government. And so my town of 1,200 people with 4 staff have the same rules and responsibilities as John's with 8,000 and as Burlington with 40,000 people is very difficult. So I think we're in the buyout process for homes. We've only done emergency fixes to the Brook Road and other roads around it. We can get ambulances and fire trucks to people's homes, but they are still very cut off in a lot of ways, and it's going to be a very long, $20 million plus project just to rebuild that road, if they decide to rebuild that road. And so we are still very much feeling the effects of this road.
We'll just say one thing before I hand it to Josh the next question. I just wanted to reflect, John, I live in Montpelier, right? I walked down there on that Tuesday morning and I saw the town underwater, and it was, it's like you're dreaming. It doesn't make any sense. And the weeks of cleanup after that were, it's like a Hollywood movie. There's just a true disaster. And I guess I just reflecting on like the real emotional toll of this, right? And that we often get into the nuts and bolts and complain about FEMA for all good reasons. But I think it's just worth it to pause and name that. Dan, I lived in the Heartbreak Hotel when I was a kid, right? And I went there and I saw that building gone, and I saw a kitchen that I once stood in, and it really is, to me, my own personal experience and hearing from you guys, it just reminds me again, like our communities are interwoven, right? Our stories, our narratives are interwoven, and what's happening in one town, the Mad River Valley, had some definite issues in 2024 that were pretty severe. In 2023, we largely escaped unscathed, and yet people in these communities are affected, right? And they're affected by what's happening in our, whether it's the local economy, right? Whether it's at this emotional level, what have you. So anyways, just wanted to share most of with you guys my reflections there.
Thank you, Ira. So, follow-up question: as you and others in your communities responded during these storms, what individuals, roles, and organizations stood up to make a difference? And as a aside as sort of the next part, when you think about the next storm, what structures are in place and how are they being sustained between when they happen and what's the plan?
So who stood up to help? I would say anyone and everyone, and I am sure I will forget some in my notes and retelling, but I would start with our municipal staff and folks like our fire chief and our public works who were out all night clearing roads and talking about closures. A group of local community members and select board members and all of us camped for about 3 weeks in the municipal offices. Like I said, just dispatching volunteers. Folks had learned that was where to show up to get help. And the Rotary Club provided meals for people, and folks showed up with donations. I know similar things were happening in other communities as well. And that was kind of the original structure of just people who had the ability to help, knew there was a need, stepping up to do that. And when I hear these comments about kind of this like repetitive, I think a piece of that is we learned so much, and it was also just pure adrenaline. It was everyone just getting through it because there was things to do and people to help, and you didn't really sleep and you didn't really leave, and you just kind of did what needed to get done. And parts of that really worked. We were able to get help to a lot of people, again, in that immediate point. As Dan said, I just can't echo enough. So good at the response, good at getting people that right away help, and that the recovery piece is that longer one. I would say in Waterbury, in terms of who's helping now on a longer term and think about formalizing it, we've had kind of a pretty broad approach. So we have municipal government. I work again with towns across the state, so I'm aware we have the luxury of things like a municipal manager, a full-time professional human who helps us do things. Even with that, and even with a full-time planner, we ended up hiring a part-time grant coordinator, because especially as we got to this thinking about recovery and resilience, just the hours needed to research and be proactive and bring partners from the state and the regional planning commission together. One piece of the puzzle was, again, not just purely town government role. Part of that is also because Waterbury has a lot of state-owned property, so some of our projects also had to do with interfacing with the state and the bureaucracy involved in that. Another side of it was saying, wow, we have this incredible volunteer response, and how do we take those lessons learned and formalize them and have space for that in the future? So we created a natural disaster preparedness committee. They worked to pull together everything from the volunteer waiver we used to the list of materials. And then again, 2 years later, we now have budgeted a small part-time stipend, again, to have someone help be that point of contact, someone who can drop anything, and also just be thinking about what it takes to be ready, because there will be a next time. And so what are the steps we're doing to make that happen? An organization I want to give enormous credit to for their work that is still ongoing is CREW. That's our long-term recovery organization. It's community resilience for the greater Waterbury area. Back to that question of the differences between 2023 and 2024. When that organization formed, as we again transitioned from out of that immediate response into that long-term recovery, helping folks navigate the FEMA process and kind of one-on-one support that was needed. A local board formed. Again, there had been a version of this after Tropical Storm Irene in Waterbury, and they unwound it. And so all of a sudden in 2023, we had to rebuild a previous structure that had existed to have a local long-term recovery group. But in doing so, that group also said, well, most of the flooding for this was along the Winooski River, and they actually picked a 5-town area. So they served not just Waterbury, but also Bolton, Duxbury, Moortown, and Middlesex. So moving into some of your more neighboring communities. And that was a decision they made, because there were some folks who even had Waterbury addresses, but technically lived in another community. And we said, again, you are our neighbors, you are part of our community, and that organization agreed to serve them. I spoke with their now executive director today. They have 105 open cases. The community members who are maybe just waiting for a FEMA check that they think is on the way, or maybe still don't know if they should repair the heating system in their home that's been approved for a FEMA buyout, but have not proceeded in the process. So they're the ones who, to what is unresolved, have been carrying this piece of individual support, including for these individuals who are impacted in multiple different disasters, and looking for ways to provide support. as I mentioned, they took that 5-town area and in 2024 also had some incredibly severe needs with folks who lost septic systems, lost private roads, the different types of flooding events, particularly in those 5 communities, not just in Waterbury, meant that there was even more impact. So all that being a long way of saying it's been a team effort, it's been local volunteer organizations, it's been work that's happening under the jurisdiction of the town, and then also under nonprofit and community organizations. And to me, the hardest part about July 10th, 2024 was saying we did this a year ago, and I'm not sure if we're in a better place right now. And it's not that we weren't. We have learned a lot and we were better, but that inevitability of we've learned so much and it still is not going to make it go away, I think is the really hard emotional part for me personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think very, very similar answers. So everybody and anybody stepped up. So since we weren't hit very hard in 2023, we weren't really ready as a town in any meaningful way. The day after the flood, I went down to the Opera House, which is one of our municipal buildings, and just saw an emergency manager we have who that day and for 3 or 4 weeks after worked 80 or 90 hours a week as a retired 78-year-old volunteer to try to figure out how to help our town not be able to deal with everything. And so I took over volunteer management. My wife took over a lot of the data stuff. We just kept finding people. Oh, you know how to make a website? You're going to make a website. Oh, you actually have some construction experience. You're now our foreman, which means you're going to go to all the sites we're cleaning and like help them figure out what the hell we're supposed to do. Because no one at any of the houses had any idea. It was just like, get the sludge out. How do we do that? How do we, some people didn't know how to set up sump pumps. Some people, there's like so many different pieces. So everyone kind of stood up and did what they could and gave the time they could. I'll say I worked for an environmental nonprofit who said, do whatever you have to do. So I was able to full time do this. My wife took basically all of her state vacation time and did this. Other people just kind of made it work because there is no structure. There's no structure in the state level. The state gives you a book that's like, here is the hierarchy and processes that you're supposed to follow. But they don't actually give you any way to do it, like realistically, nor do they have staff to support you in setting it up. Because I specifically asked for that and they said they didn't have staff to do that. I'm like, can you just come here and be like, this person does this and this person does this, and then we'll know? And they're like, oh, we don't have staff for that. So it was a lot of us just trying to figure it out. I will also say, like, from a volunteer perspective, like I said a few times last year, the people that showed up, the Christians, the queers, and the CrossFitters. Those are the people that showed up for us. Christian groups like the Hope Coalition, the Mennonites, like a lot of these groups just showed up and were like, what can we do? Here's our skills. They actually had skills. They knew way more about doing this than we did because they've done it across the state. In some cases, we were getting folks from Pennsylvania and other states coming up as part of mission trips. The queers, we have a huge BIPOC, LGBTQ community in Plainfield. And they showed up. They have their own mutual aid system set up as a community, and they use those, and they showed up in big ways. And then Green Mountain CrossFit showed up many, many times. Why they adopted us versus other towns, I don't know, but it was 10 to 15 like very physically active people showing up in a group and doing a lot of stuff, which was great. So we had those kinds of folks. We didn't know. We weren't sure what kind of volunteers we were going to get. The first Saturday that we were like, please show up and help us, we thought, okay, if we get 20 people, we know what they can do. And we had like 140 people show up. We definitely didn't know what to have 140 people do, but we got them out there. I think we know more now what to do. We still don't, the systems are still pretty impossible. We will never have a staff capacity as a town to meet these disasters. Like, it's just not possible. One other place that stepped up for us, because we called, is the city of Montpelier. We called the city of Montpelier the day after the floods. When somebody who lived in town worked for the rec department, and we said, what are we supposed to do? We actually did this last year, and Merrick from the recreation department came over and showed us FEMA forms, showed us all sorts of things that we should be doing from day one. And then 3 weeks later, we were like, we need to get all this silt out of our downtown. It's just like all over people's lawns, all over parts of the roads. And we were told by the state, we remove garbage, we don't remove silt. And we're like, well, we don't have an actual way to do this. And the city of Montpelier drove over some heavy equipment and removed the silt for us. just out of the goodness of their own heart, and we're really appreciative. I would just, it was really, we wouldn't have known what to do, and we would have done things so much worse. I mean, one example is we're going to have to probably give a matching amount of around $700,000 at the end of the day for all of the work that we're having done through FEMA. Because Merrick showed us how to write the forms right, we have 220,000 of that in volunteer hours already documented in the system. That's only because Merrick came and showed us the right forms and showed us how to do it right. And if he hadn't done that, we would have had volunteer sign-ins, but we never would have gotten credit for most of that. So we know more, but we're never, at the town of 1,200, ever going to be in a place where we structurally alone can deal with these disasters.
Here's a cool thing about Merrick, who works for the Parks Department in Montpelier, is that he's a AmeriCorps member. Right? We're not talking about someone who he's an incredible AmeriCorps member. Who really, what Dan just shared about how he served Plainfield in the 2023 flood, he was the face of our volunteer hub in so many ways. And not only the face of our volunteer hub, but really built some of the systems, because systems matter. Just like we heard, you have to track that volunteer time, because essentially that's currency for you when you're working with FEMA. So in Montpelier, the volunteer hub was really the face of our response in 2023, and there was really three principles when it came to making that volunteer hub happen. One, as I've mentioned, was the city. Actually, the parks director, Alex, along with Merrick, and then we have a program in the summer called the Montpelier Youth Conservation Corps, and that made up a lot of labor, a great crew of like high school age kids that you could just task this stuff, not to mention the hundreds of volunteers who were showing up on a daily basis. So you had the city sort of serving as a backbone for the volunteer coordination effort, but also you have Montpelier Alive and Katie Trout. And what happens the instant you experience a catastrophe like that is everybody's job description just transforms in an instant, right? And so Katie Trout, she was hired like months before, essentially to promote Montpelier and bring businesses together to support downtown. All of a sudden, her role was transformed to supporting businesses sort of one after another, and really serving as the liaison between those businesses and the city, those businesses and the volunteer hub, and frankly, those businesses in the world. Because there's a whole other aspect to this, which is when you have that moment of disaster, as crass as it sounds, you've got to be ready for it from sort of a visibility standpoint. The world is ready to respond with you in that moment. And so another partner in this work was the Montpelier Foundation, that essentially to serve as like the bank account so that the money from around the world could flow into our city and then get dispensed back out to our businesses. Because you can't, even a business in downtown that was not flood impacted was all of a sudden in a ghost town for months, right? So just the business disruption side of things for businesses, much less the loss in inventory, the financial toll was absolutely gargantuan. So let me though shift to talk about where we are now in terms of our sort of organizational ecosystem. And I haven't talked about the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience. We're fortunate to have a gentleman named Paul Costello, former executive director of the Vermont Council on Rural Development. Paul lives in Montpelier. He is Montpelier's biggest booster, I would say. And Paul, if folks know, is sort of a master of facilitation. And he helped lead a series of 3 community conversations in the 2 months after the flood. And those were really difficult conversations because, as we've all alluded to, when you experience something as drastic and you have a sense that it is the new normal, right? It is not like a once in 100-year thing, but a genuine sense in the community that our precipitation patterns have shifted and we are going to face this again. it is an existential question when you've got a downtown that lies at the confluence of the Stevens branch, the main branch, the North branch, and the Dog, right? We are where we are from a landscape perspective. And so those were hard conversations as a community. And to some degree, the debates that we had in those forums still exist. There are people in our community that say, why are we investing in repairing these downtown buildings? They're just going to flood again. We've got this nice Vermont College green. We should just migrate our downtown up the hill. That's a living debate in our community, the one about sort of reinvest or retreat. And it's valid. The truth is, like, there's validity in both sides of that argument. But the sense was that we had to identify priorities as a community that we could rally around in terms of how we make a more resilient place. And we are doing that at a variety of scales and trying to build the apparatus to carry that work forward in an ongoing way. And so we now have a long-term recovery group. We did not have one before 2023. A long-term recovery group is essentially, their function is to cover the gaps that FEMA doesn't cover. And let's be honest, we're all pretty worried that that gap that FEMA doesn't cover is only getting bigger. In fact, I think as we look at what this current administration is doing in terms of disaster declarations and changing the ratio by which they make decisions about disaster declarations, there is real uncertainty about what we can count on for federal resources when it comes to disasters, which means we really have to be thinking about what we are building with state and local resources. That's what long-term recovery groups do, is really try to cover that gap to support those who are most impacted. We've also built this organization called the Montpelier Commission for Recovery and Resilience. There's 15 volunteers to guide that work, and they hired me. And then I have the good fortune to have recruited a VISTA member, Jillian, who's sitting in the back here. We're a staff of 2, and essentially we're trying to carry this work forward as a community. We do not see ourselves as a permanent part of the organizational infrastructure in Montpelier. We see ourselves as a temporary organization trying to get things started, trying to solve some short-term needs, but then really finding homes for them that are more permanent. There's a perception, and it's not false in Vermont, which is that anytime we see a problem, we sort of start a new nonprofit to solve that problem. And so we don't want to add to that tendency. So we're working with the Montpelier Foundation. We are working with Montpelier Alive. We're thinking very intentionally about how this work is carried forward. I'll mention 2 other things quickly. No town is an island, just like Ira was talking about. Like we cannot solve these river-based problems within our own town borders. And so what that means is we really have to build our identity as a watershed. We are all connected by these rivers, and what we do upstream and downstream has impacts for all of us. And so what we've done in collaboration with the State Recovery Office, the Friends of the Renewski, a number of organizations, is we've initiated something called the Renewski Flood Resilience Collaborative. And essentially, we've had 2 convenings so far. Rebecca Deal actually presented at the last one on May 14th. The idea essentially is to get all of these municipalities from the watershed. And we're talking from Cabot all the way to Colchester. I mean, talk about different places. You can't get more different within Vermont than Cabot to Colchester. But the truth is, we're both in the Winooski watershed, and we have some shared interests. And so what we're trying to do in pulling that together is build a sense of community across the watershed. We have to know what our neighboring communities are experiencing to understand that we have a shared interest, and then to figure out how do we collaborate and work together, because we really need to work across town lines to do that work. Another example of how we're doing that is at the micro scale, which is we just launched something on Saturday called Montpelier Neighborness. And the idea is And this happens naturally in Vermont. I think it's part of what's wonderful about living in this place is we build connections with our neighbors. And in those connections, we are much more resilient as a place. When you know people, you can look after your neighbors. And when you need help, you can count on your neighbors. Maybe it's as simple as you're baking cookies and you need an egg. Or maybe it's something more extreme, which is there's a fire and you've got a neighbor who's not connected to the internet and he just needs a knock on the door to say, are you okay? Can we help you get out of that house? Right? It's all of that. But Montpelier NeighborNet is essentially trying to create a support system for that kind of hyper-local organization because our sense is we're going to need that. Whether we're talking about natural disaster or whatever the world feels like it's throwing at us on any given day, the connections and relationships that you have with our neighbors are really going to be essential in terms of how we weather these times. So I'll stop there. Sorry, I went on so long.
No worries at all, John. That was great. Thank you all. So I have another question. It's certainly burning, but I'm also just aware of the time, and so we scheduled to go towards 7:15 for the panel discussion. So that gives us 9 minutes. So I think we're just going to scoot on to questions from the audience. And I'm sure some of you have some. So if anyone has, yeah.
It's for the team. So I am very interested in hearing how people have strategized solutions, or at least attempts at solutions, to dealing with the after effects of these events. So I have 2 questions. One is the before and the other is the after. After Irene, there was a lot of discussion about what mechanical things could be done to the Mad River to change the direction of its flow, to prevent it overflowing its banks in various places. I don't know that anybody ever came up with any solutions to it. I know there was a debate about how aggressive one should be. But how do we deal with mitigating the physical effects of these rains, which are going to happen, right? It's going to happen. We already know. So we're talking about how we get together as a community to help us after it's already happened. But I would imagine after Irene, there were a lot of smart people that got together and said, okay, what can we do? And you began to touch on it when you identified the watershed as being such a long physical place. But I think I would love to hear how we address the issues of mitigating the effects of the flood and not just addressing the issues. The second part is the after effects. And I would hope that somewhere is being created a usable entity, a usable piece of information that we could communicate to every town that is potentially impacted by these floods, how to get to FEMA, how to integrate with other towns that are nearby, how to identify these volunteer organizations, where do they come from, how do we get them here? Everybody in their own way has found that community members have volunteered and been able to affect change. But I would guess there's a way of creating a network, an infrastructure that we could easily identify for the next one.
Yeah, so on the before piece, so generally, I think when you think about rivers, anytime you try to engineer an end result with a river, it's just going to have either a downstream or an upstream effect. You might fix it for your town, but you're not going to fix it for the towns around you. The Flood Safety Act passed last year in response to the 2023 floods, and that really focuses on protecting river corridors, wetlands. Wetlands both slow and filter the water, and so our wetlands are our kind of natural way to slow down the rivers and cause less flash flooding and do a lot of other things. And dam safety pieces, because we have a lot of dams that are actually causing big problems on our rivers, on our streams in different places, that are either inflating the levels of rivers that make it much more likely that there could be flooding, or they are causing effects in the rivers that aren't used to. I'll just say, like, if a river wants to go somewhere, it's going to go there. Like we can try to over manage it as much as possible, but it's like, so we need to build and think about growth away from the rivers and around the rivers, knowing where the full scale of where the river could be. I mean, that's the before river, and it's really looking, and there are solutions, and that bill is still in rulemaking, and like everything in government takes a long time. And so, but there are a lot of great ideas already out there that Agency of Natural Resources and others are working on to try to make things better. I will say there have already been moves in the last year since we passed that to start to scale back some of those wetland provisions, because wetlands also intersects with one of our other big needs, which is housing. And so folks want to build more housing, even if it's on wetlands. And so we have this push and pull about where we can build the housing we need versus where we need wetlands to actually protect from these big flooding disasters. So that's going to be a continued tension that you'll see, and that'll be a part of the conversation. It was part of the conversation this year in the State House that didn't go anywhere, but it's still going to be part of the conversation going forward. I think I do think, creating materials and doing some things. There is another this year, the flood bill that was passed, was sponsored by, signed today. There we go. The governor signed it today. Representative Wazak from Barry, who's another flood community, was the lead sponsor of, with a Republican representative, Gina Galfredi from Barry Town, is really looking at how do we beef up our emergency management system on the state level? How do we give them more resources, but also more responsibility? And specifically on parts that I actually worked on in the bill, where how do we actually get the state to be required to assist municipalities in these ways that we've identified? It's not going to be a panacea. There's still going to be a lot of holes and a lot of problems, but I think because of the way our state is set up, we're going to need our states and our regional planning commissions to play big roles if we're going to have the kind of knowledge bank that you're talking about. Because for every one of the 251 towns in the state to have that knowledge bank doesn't seem realistic.
I'll just add quickly, Waterway has a study. You can go read it. I think it had 22 suggested action ideas after Tropical Storm Irene, many of which happened. I mentioned the municipal office complex is not where it was. And I think we should learn from them, and I take it really seriously. I think a lot of what we're doing now is finding grant funding to fund the second portion of things that got cut out of the original recommendations after Irene. So we hear the best practice, we hear this is the parcel you should look at, and we don't have a willing seller, or we don't have some other piece of the puzzle that needs to come together. And so I think that's the work of us as local elected officials, also noting that these have not insignificant costs. And so how do we really make that to the community? And again, heard on the materials, I will name too, I think in these immediate response scenarios, it's as much someone to help you sort through the information as having the information. Vermont League of Cities and Towns has done a great job, now has resources coded by materials. If you still have one town staffer and like 2 people who haven't slept in 3 days trying to figure out the right FEMA form, you could have all the right links, and it's sometimes still hard. So appreciate the point.
In Montpelier, we're very much thinking about the mitigation piece. We, in fact, tonight we have a city council meeting where we're talking about a parcel that's called 5 Home Farm Way. It's behind the Agway. If you think about the roundabout in Montpelier and where the Agway is, there's a piece of land that's an old house that unfortunately is flooded enough that house needs to come down. But there's 14 acres of land. It's where the Stevens branch comes into the Winooski. And essentially, we're going to do a floodplain restoration project right there in Montpelier. Here's the hard reality of that: is that project has value. In fact, we've made the first cut in terms of the state deciding which projects they're going to fund and which they aren't. So that is a measure that it has value. But the reality of an inundation event like we experienced in Montpelier is that it takes a lot of floodplain restoration to have a meaningful impact in reducing that inundation level. And so we have to confront that reality. We can't just sort of put our blinders on about that reality. We need to continue that work of floodplain reconnection because it does have value, and it has particularly local value, just like dam removals have really important local values because water backs up where there's a dam, and a lot of these legacy dams, they're actually dangerous they're ecologically bad and they're exacerbating flooding. So we just got to get them out. So we're talking about removing 2 or 3 dams in Montpelier as part of that hazard mitigation goal. But the other thing that we want to support in Montpelier is you can make your buildings more flood resilient. Like there are, and in fact, that's a lot of, when you talk about our city hall, you know, we're not, unlike Waterbury that actually relocated that city hall, we're talking about our historic city hall and sticking with that building. But there is expertise in engineering that can allow you to retrofit that building to make it significantly more resilient. One of the obvious things is get the utilities out of harm's way. You've got to get them up above flood elevation, but then there's a bunch of other measures you can do to some of these old buildings. I will also say, and Dan's already said this, like we have to make really hard decisions about where we're putting new development. Like let's not contribute to the problem by adding more assets in the flood zone. Like as hard as that is, I don't want to pretend that's a simple statement, but the reality is in communities, those are really hard decisions. When you need housing, you need jobs, you need economic development, those are really tough choices to make. But if there's one thing we should take away from this increase in precipitation, it's about making some of those really, really tough choices.
Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you guys for the answers. I would just, add in specifically for the Mad River Valley, from my understanding, following Tropical Storm Irene, a lot of the same conclusions were reached, that we probably shouldn't be building in the river corridor, that we should probably be protecting our headwater, that we should be finding ways to spongify the landscape, right, to sink water in where it lands. And, it's easier said than done, right? Like they're very challenging questions to address. And, groups like, Friends of the Mad River, we work at it from one angle, Josh in the planning district works at it from another angle. I think that part of the motivation originally for us to actually, bring you guys in and have this panel discussion is that we also just need to maintain a momentum and an awareness around this context, right? It's easy to get muddled and mired in like the little details of moving one particular project forward and lose the bigger picture. And so I'm really appreciative of getting that bigger picture from all of you guys. And, we can sort of return to good thinking, right? There was good thinking that was done following these storms, and really have that guide us as we get back into the trenches of doing the day-to-day. Other questions from the audience? All right. It's 7:18. Would you guys humor me for one more question? But I'm just curious, this last one that we have. So, as I've mentioned this several times already, but these floods have really encouraged us to look beyond our traditional watershed boundaries and learn from the leadership of neighboring communities. How have these events moved you or your communities to reimagine established boundaries, limitations, or identities?
This is kind of a technical response, which maybe isn't what you're looking for, but it's also a chance to say something, which is we've already alluded to the fact that we need to work in a regional way and not just a town by town way. And let me just say, you all should appreciate the organizational infrastructure you have in the Friends of the Mad River and the Mad River Planning District. You already have these regional entities that tie the Mad River Valley together, and that is, to some degree, that's what we're trying to create across the Winooski, something like what you have here, although, of course, Friends of the Winooski is a great partner in that work. The state of Vermont did something, I'm going to compliment the state of Vermont on something they did in terms of, we have an opportunity, as I've alluded to, around this hazard mitigation grant program, about $80 million coming from the federal government to go to communities to mitigate their flood hazards and other hazards. And the state did something that I don't think they've done in the same way before, which is they actually contracted with a private river engineering firm in collaboration with the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission to work with a few of these communities to essentially build a list of prospective projects. So in Montpelier, we had a list of 30 possible hazard mitigation projects that were in consideration. And then the engineer did a lot of work, and the Regional Planning Commission did some community engagement work to winnow that list down to ultimately 5 proposals that got submitted to the state on behalf of the city of Montpelier. In normal times, what happens is they announce a grant and they say, have at it, cities, and cities have to do all of that work to do the analysis and to put those proposals together. And the state had the wisdom to do this in a regional way and to bring in expertise to really support towns. And the good news is we have submissions that went in, but we also have a list of 30 prospective projects that we can go back to again and again. That list doesn't go away. That has real value for us. That was a program called the River Program here in Vermont. And I would say it's a model for how the state works, covers the gap between the state and municipalities in terms of navigating complicated systems and getting projects done. So that's been a really helpful model for us in terms of how we started to refine our list of work in Montpelier.
Yes, we have. We identified many projects. I'll specifically call out. This would be 2016 to 2018. We did a stormwater master planning project. So this sort of was directly following the wisdom that we gained Tropical Storm Irene. And it was really about managing stormwater, right? So we do have inundation issues periodically, but we really have erosion issues in the valley. And so stormwater, these big flashy storms, these downpours can damage our roads, blow out culverts, infrastructure, and things like that. So the master planning process, I think, identified 25 projects per the 5 towns in the watershed, and then 5 per town went on to preliminary design. And I don't know the exact number, but a number of those did go on to implementation. And I think largely the hurdle towards if we have these plans, we have these projects, it's money and it's capacity, right? It's the capacity of the towns, capacity of organizations. We can only sort of do so much, and it gets into the pipeline, and we sort of chunk one after another. I will just shout out, we did just hire someone to be a watershed project coordinator specifically with these stormwater master plans and these kinds of projects in mind to really bolster the capacity of this community to get those projects, moving again and get them in the ground.
So working with and learning from neighboring communities, we're doing it right now. I have follow-up questions for John and Dan, whether they know it or not. So we're going to chat a little more after this. And I would say to me, it's about building and fostering those relationships on the sunny days, because there's nothing like the morning after you have water on Main Street and Waterway to say, oh, we should probably check in with the Middlesex Select Board. Does anyone have a number? I think we as Vermonters can sometimes become very invested in our specific town geographic identity. And we sometimes have folks who have an address that says one town and a tax bill for another. And so I think this idea of just thinking in a more collaborative way has so much wisdom. Credit to John and the regional convenings that have happened have just reinforced that and really just continuing to show up in those ways. I'm going to take 30 extra seconds as a select board member with a microphone and say that we are essentially unpaid volunteers, and you know us and you can reach us. So if you're leaving tonight and thinking that flood mitigation and resiliency and collaborating with neighbors are important things, I would encourage you to take 2 to 5 minutes to show up on public comment for your select board. Apologies to Mad River Valley select board members everywhere. But truly, when I think about what comes up on public comment in my community, we are, again, volunteers with limited capacity, and the things that show up often are the things that I give more time and energy to. And I wish I could say I did more strategic and long-term thinking, but in an environment of scarcity, sometimes those things that are more present are the things that I give more attention to. So I think it's just a useful reminder that one of the values of these small Vermont towns is that you really have that sway with local decision makers. And it's reinforcing for those folks and for the community to hear that other people care about this. We in Waterbury are going to proceed with this work anyway. We have a lot of community support. And it's always nice to have reminders that that's the case.
Yeah, you folks in Waitsfield, call Brian Shoup. He's my former boss, so I'm happy to say call Brian Shoup. He's retired now, so he's got lots of time on his hands. And give him a call. And I know I'm already getting told on immediately. Yeah, as a select board member in Plainfield, I think I agree. And so what I would say, what we are really thinking about as a select board is all ideas are good ideas. And so right now, 15 residents have gotten together in September of last year and started thinking about how do we turn 20 acres uphill from our village into new housing, and how do we create that as a public project so it's affordable. It's a long process. They met weekly for months, and now we're at a point where we have a town committee that's looking at it. That's slightly different people, but we don't know if it's going to work or not. We're still trying to figure out if we as a town can get the money and invest in water, wastewater, and road infrastructure to build out 10 of those 20 acres that aren't wetlands to create lots that can become housing for folks, because we know we're going to lose. The houses that are getting bought out from this last 2024 flood are not going to get rebuilt on, and they are, I mean, in a lot of ways, almost half of our village. If you go to Plainfield today, you will be very easy to see where they are, because there's still destruction kind of everywhere. There's still houses that are silted in because they decided it was easier just to walk away from them than clean them up. And those are all going to be gone. It's going to be a green space. But if we want to keep the village as a vibrant thing, which has already been hard for a small town in Vermont, we need to make sure there's still houses in that village. Goddard has just been bought as a campus. Their owner there, private person, has lots of ideas. We're no ideas are bad ideas right now. We're saying kind of yes and to everything, and thinking about how we as a town might have to be different. Like a lot of longtime residents have told us, well, the town doesn't buy land and build water and wastewater and road. Like housing developers do that. Well, there's no housing developers beating down our door to do it. And so we as a town have to look at if we can do that. And so we're just trying to figure out how we can play a role, how we can, use the leverage of these floods and the attention we've gotten from the state government, from FEMA, and from other places to say, how do we bring in as much money to the community as possible and do the most good? And a lot of times, just the way it works, they want to give money to the town. And so we just have to take on these roles. But we are, again, all volunteers. All of our communities are volunteers. We have a very small staff. And so it's a balancing act to try to figure out what we can do, but we're trying to.
Email your select board member and offer to help if you're interested in this, because if not, it's one more thing for the select board member, but maybe you're really excited and might want to help.
Cool. Thank you all. I think we can wrap up. So I'll just say, John, Alyssa, Dan, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you've shared with us, and thank you all for coming out, and Josh, thank you for partnering on this. And the last thing I'll say is I believe there is some dessert if people want to hang out, have more conversation. You can stay here. You don't have to go home. Thanks, everyone.
That's a good line.